Hello everyone and welcome to another Fusion 360 Live. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk. On the keyboard I have my friend Angelo Juris. He'll be answering the chat questions. If you have anything in there, please feel free to post in there, and he'll send those questions to me and I'll try and randomly look through and answer those as we go through this session. We left off last time after we created the wheels and the wheel assembly. So we're getting fairly close to finishing this whole project. All that's left to do is to create the support arms that wood gets supported with. So that's what we're going to work on today. Also, before we dive in, I get asked this a lot on how do I rotate and make things so smooth. I'm using one of these 3D connection mice. I don't see if you can see the name there, 3D connection. If you do a lot of CAD work, we highly recommend a 3D mouse like this. So that's how I'm getting the smooth rotation as panning and zooming around. Okay, so we are going to work on the assembly that kind of goes into this little black plastic part. So I'm going to do some review, and I'm also going to show some tips and tricks on different methodologies on doing some of this stuff. So I'm going to start by creating a new component, and hopefully you all know that components are awesome. We should be creating everything as components instead of just bodies. So I'm going to say new component, and I'll give this a name. I'll just call this extension arm. And I now have a new component that's active called extension arm. So I need to create a tube, and I'm going to show two different methods on doing this. So recently we added the thin extrude, so I'm going to show that method, and then I'm also going to show the shell method. So I'm going to create a rectangle here, and I'm just going to do it out in space because then we're going to end up moving the component into the correct location. So I need to draw a 30 by 30 rectangle. So here's something kind of interesting. I could type in 30, and then I could hit tab and type in 30 and hit enter. And it's going to create a rectangle that's 30 by 30. Or, let me do a rectangle. I'm just going to create a random sized rectangle. Throw one dimension. So I'm going to say 30. And then I want this wall to be equal to that wall, so I'll use a constraint, an equal constraint. I'll say that and that have to be equal. And now you notice we have an equal sized rectangle. So why would I do it like this? Well, if I ever wanted to change the size of it, there's only one dimension that I have to change. I say 50, sorry. You'll notice that this line also is 50. So it's a faster way of changing the overall size of an equal sized rectangle. I could have typed in 30, I could have typed in 30, but then I'd have to change those two dimensions. So one method. Now if I want to do the thin extrude, but I wanted to have filleted edges, I'm going to have to fillet in my sketch. I personally don't like to use the fillet command in my sketch, and you'll see why here in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and say fillet. I'll click on an intersection or a corner there. You can kind of see the preview. And I want this to be a 2 millimeter fillet. Now I'm not going to hit enter, because if I do, it's going to end my command and I'd have to type in 2 again. So I'm just going to continue clicking on these intersections. And notice I get a warning. Constraints and or dimensions were removed during this fillet operation. And this is kind of why I don't like to do complicated sketches. And let me show you what happened here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And notice my sketch has gotten a lot more complicated, a lot more icons on the screen. And if I were to change this from 30 to 50, notice that this line is no longer equal. And the reason for that is because when I added these fillets, the equal sign, the equal constraint basically got removed, got changed. So I would have to add that back in there. I could say equal, I want that line and that line to be equal, which would still work because the fillets are all the same. In fact, you can see the equal sign on the fillets. They're the same as this 1 over here. Now if I were to change this from 30 to 50, it should stay an equal sized rectangle, which it does. So that's one of the reasons I like to keep my sketches simple. Just keep it a simple rectangle and then do the fillets in 3D. That's how I would prefer. But I needed to do this to use, I'm going to finish my sketch, to use the new thin extrude. So if I select my profile and I start to extrude, it's a solid. But if I come over here and click on this thin extrude, it makes it a hollow pipe. And I can specify what I want that wall thickness to be. So let's just say 2 in this case, and you can kind of see how it thickened that up. Now the only reason, let me change that back to 1 so you can kind of see. The reason you have to fillet the sketch is, notice how the fillet is on the inside here, so it basically offset that profile. So that's why you do the fillets in the sketch. Now I'm going to do a thickness of 2, and it basically gets rid of that because that's a fillet of 2 and that's a thickness of 2. So it doesn't really matter in this case. Also notice my units are in millimeters. So by default I'm in millimeters, but I can also type in, for example, 42 IN, 42 inches. So let me zoom out so you can kind of see what's going on here. And it's going to convert that for me automatically. I don't have to do the math. I just type in 42 IN and it's going to extrude 42 inches. I'll say OK. So a couple tips there using the thin extrude. Now we're going to do a couple pieces like this, and the next one I'm not going to use thin extrude. Okay, so I want to position this bar where it needs to go. I like to put my joints kind of at the top level, so I'm going to activate my top level here. And I want this bar to be perfectly centered inside this box right here. And you'll notice I don't have a sharp outside edge to line up with a sharp inside edge, for example. So we're going to use a command called between two faces. So I'm going to create a joint. I'll move this so you can kind of see it. And this icon right here is between two faces. So check out how this works. It's really kind of cool. I'm going to click on that icon. Plane 1, I'm going to select that face there. Plane 2, I'm going to select this face over here. And now it's asking for a snap. Now, it's going to be kind of hard to see what's going on here, but you can see that it's basically creating a plane that's slicing through between those two faces. And now it's asking for basically like the origin. Well, I'm going to do the middle. So I'm going to kind of move this direction, and you can see that little joint icon is now kind of in the middle. It's, again, kind of hard to show there, but you can see the little arms right there. So all I have to do is get kind of near the middle here and click. Even though I'm not even on that icon, I'm just going to click right there, and it grabbed the middle between those two faces, and it grabbed the middle of the length. Okay, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the box over here. I want it to slide right in between the faces there. So I'm going to say between two faces. I'll say let's do that face there and that face there. Okay, and then you'll notice if I kind of zoom up on here, I can just kind of hover over this face and it's grabbing the middle. So there's like a start, a middle, and an end right there. I'm just going to grab this one right here and watch what happens. Okay, so it brings the bar into the location. Let me go ahead and animate this so you can kind of see what's going on. You can see the center of the bar is now the center there, but obviously it's sliding in the wrong direction. So let's try the x-axis, and there you can see it's sliding correctly. And if we look at it like so, you will see that this light gray shape is perfectly centered. Not only left to right, but up and down. So how is that possible? Well, we told it to find the center of this gray box and find the center of this black box. And so that's how it did the up and down. And then it also did the left and right because we picked on the left wall and the right wall, and it found the midpoint or the center of that. So that between two faces is a really powerful command. I can, if I want to, I can position this bar wherever I want, you know, to offset at a certain distance. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it kind of sticking halfway out. And I'll say OK. So I now have a slider joint where I can slide that bar back and forth. Okay. Now we're going to kind of create the little arm that kind of comes off of this. And I'm going to do this in a slightly different method instead of the thin extrude. So I'm going to create a new component. And I'll call it support arm. Support arm. And again, the outline that I'm kind of using, I've included into the description of the video. So you guys are totally welcome to download that and try this on your own. So I'm going to use a box primitive. Okay, so instead of creating a sketch and then drawing a rectangle and then extruding it, etc., this time I'm going to say I want to create a box primitive. And I'm just going to, again, kind of do it out here in space somewhere. Let's just do like right here. And I want it to be 30. And I'll say 30 again. Okay. Now, in that situation, I didn't have the option to add a constraint because I'm not in a sketch. So I actually did have to type in 30 and 30. Now it's asking for a height. So in this example here, I'm going to do 55. And you'll see it will create a rectangular box, 30 by 30 by 55. Then I'm going to go ahead and position this into place. So once again, I kind of like to activate my top level. I'll add a joint. And check this out. I'm going to kind of hover over this face, and you can see that little joint origin icon's right in the center. Well, I basically want to line up this middle of this bottom edge, or I might want to say like the middle of this edge here or a corner. And you can see I can just kind of hover over those. Now be a little bit careful. Notice as soon as I move onto the line, my joint origin kind of goes flat along that line. But if I stay on that face, it's now flat to that face. So I'm going to just grab that midpoint right there. I'll rotate a little bit so you can still kind of see that. And then I can come over here and you'll notice there's a top, middle, and a bottom down here. So I'm just going to grab the middle right there and watch what it does. Now it remembers my last motion type was a slider. I'm going to say I want that to be a rigid. And so it basically lined up the middle of this edge of the rectangle to the middle of the edge of the pipe. And I want it to be rigid, so you can kind of see they're kind of welded together. And I'll say OK. Now I want to shell this guy out, but before I shell, I'm going to go ahead and fillet these edges just in case. I'm going to say 2 here. I can even pick through my model, which I love. I don't have to even rotate. And now I have a 2mm fillet on all 4 corners. I'll say OK. Now I want to shell this out to be hollow. So I'm going to click on that face. And I just realized something. I kind of messed up. Notice I made this guy active. So my support arm isn't active. And if I were to activate this guy right now, notice there's the fillet, right? So Fusion was smart enough to put the fillets on that support arm, even though I didn't have that as my active component. And I think that is extremely cool. I personally like to make sure I'm in my active component, and we can see we did a box primitive and then we did a fillet. Now I'm going to do my shell. So I'm going to click on that face and say shell. We want to do 2 millimeters, but now I have a problem. I need to shell the back face also, but it's kind of buried or covered up by this other extrusion. Well, I'm going to click and hold for about a second, and you can see it found a chain, it found a face, it found another face. It's basically like probing through. So I'm just going to find that particular face, and that's it right there. So I'm going to click there, and it is now shelling all the way through. In fact, if I were to turn off that extension arm, we can see it allowed me to select that back face that was buried by this other part. So again, that's just clicking and holding for about a second, and it allows you to kind of probe through and pick different options. Okay. So I now have a similar result as when we did the sketch with a thin extrude. Which one's better? I don't know. I personally like to keep my sketches simple, so I did the shell command, but that added a couple more features in my timeline. I have a fillet feature, I have the shell feature. With the sketch, I just have a sketch and an extrude, right? So less features in my timeline, but harder to go back and change the fillet size if I want to. I'd have to know to go back to that sketch. So again, it's whatever you decide you guys like. I personally like to use the shell command and keep my sketch simple. In fact, I didn't even use a sketch. I just used a box primitive. In fact, I'm going to do that again for the next pipe here, coming up here in just a little bit. As I look at this, I decide, you know what? I don't want this block to be right at the very edge because it doesn't give me a lot of room to weld. In fact, it only gives me basically this edge here, maybe these top two edges, but I want to have a weld over here. Well, let's go ahead and edit that last joint right here. I'm going to say edit joint. Now notice what happened. Why is my part not shelled anymore? Well, we're going back in time. We created this box primitive, and then we positioned it into place, and then we filleted it, and then we shelled it out. So we're back before we did the fillets and we did the shell. So that's why it looks a little bit different. Don't worry about that. We're just kind of back in time a little bit. I'm going to start to drag this arrow, and you can see it's going to allow me to drag in that direction, and I can specify an offset. Let's just give it maybe like 8 millimeters or so. And then watch what happens when I say OK. It goes down through the timeline, and it completes the fillet, and it completes the shell. And now I have lots of edges that I could use to weld this piece on. Okay, now I want to create like a little vertical arm. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. Right mouse click, new component. I'll give it a name. Let's call it support arm vertical. Okay. Do another box primitive because I find that pretty fast. I'll do it kind of on this top plane here. I'm just going to draw it out to the side. Again, doesn't matter. Now this one's slightly larger. It's 35 by 35 instead of 30 by 30. And it's 60 millimeters tall. So 60, there we go. I'll go ahead and fillet. And this has a much smaller fillet. It's only 1 millimeter. I'm just going to go ahead and fillet those guys. Say OK. And then shell. 1.5 for the thickness. So it's a little bit thinner metal. And again, I don't even have to rotate. I can click and hold and grab that face. And it's now rotating all the way through. I'm sorry, rotating, shelled all the way through as I rotate. I'll say OK. And I want to go ahead and position this in the correct location. So I'll, again, activate the top level, create a joint, and I basically want this bottom edge, the center of that bottom edge, to line up with the center of this bottom edge. So you can kind of see right there. Now I'm going to zoom out so you can kind of watch what's going to happen here. Let me see if I can do this. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and click there, and you'll see it'll bring that part and line those up. And so it's perfectly centered. And it remembered my last motion type as rigid. I'll say OK. And I now have that part located where it needs to be. If I grab this arm, we can see that all those pieces move together because I used the rigid joint command to build them kind of in their location. Okay, but you'll notice I now have the extension arm, the support arm, this guy, kind of all as like separate parts. I like to kind of keep things organized, so I'm going to create a new component, and I'm going to call this extension arm assembly. Extension arm assembly. So you can see it created a new component called extension arm assembly, and now I can either control or shift click and select all three of those. I'm just going to drag that into the extension arm assembly. If I expand that open, there we go. And this is a really quick way to turn multiple things on and off. So if I turn the assembly off, everything underneath it has to get turned off. Excuse me. Okay. Also, I kind of know I'm going to continue designing some stuff here. I want it to be in this assembly. So instead of right-clicking up here and saying new component, I can now right-click on this extension arm assembly and say new component, and it's going to create it underneath this assembly there. So I'm going to start doing a workpiece support. So let's call this workpiece support assembly. And you can see I now have this workpiece support assembly in there. And underneath there, I'm going to create the roller. So I haven't even drawn anything yet. I'm kind of building the structure. So I know I'm going to have a roller in here, so I'll give that a name. And now we're working on the roller component in the workpiece support assembly, which is in the extension arm assembly. And you'll see why I'm doing this later on, as we can turn things on and off really easily. Okay, so I'm going to, again, create a primitive. We're going to create a roller, which is basically a cylinder. So I'm going to say cylinder. Let's just do it on this kind of this front face. And I'm just going to do it out here in space a little bit. I want this to be 48 millimeters in diameter. But for the height, again, I love showing this. I want to do inches. In fact, I want to do some weird inches. I'm going to say 9 7/8 IN, and you can see it instantly updates and gives me my preview. So I did 9 7/8 inches, and I didn't have to do the math or anything like that. So I'll say OK, and we get that guy. Now, I want it to be hollow, so I'm going to have to shell it out. And some of you might be, well, how come you didn't use the pipe command? I could have, but notice what the description says. Creates a solid pipe that follows a selected path. So, yes, I could have specified a wall thickness and all that kind of stuff, but I'd have to have a sketch that defines the path. So instead, I'm just going to do a cylinder. We'll do the shell command. I'll go ahead and probe through to grab that guy. And let's do 1.5 thickness for the roller. So pop a quiz. How many times have I had to go to the top here to click any icons. Hopefully you've noticed hardly at all. In fact, I think I haven't even gone up there yet. I might have once or twice, but I've been doing everything with my right mouse click. The shell command, the new component command is the right mouse click and all that kind of stuff. So definitely get used to right mouse clicking and seeing what options you have. It really speeds up your design process. And you don't have to hunt for those commands that you don't know where they might be. So, okay. I now have the cylinder and I want to create a rectangular tube that's going to come up and touch this round surface here. And I know it needs to be 9 inches long. So I need to create an offset plane from the center of this cylinder. So if I come into construct, you can see offset plane, but that needs to come from a face or a plane. I could do plane at an angle, but it's asking for a line. Okay, so I don't have a line. Well, I could try tangent plane. Well, that kind of works, but it's on top of the part, and I want it to slice through the middle of it. So none of these really are going to help me. However, I'm going to do an axis through a cylinder. So check this out. I'm going to say axis. I can click on, like, for example, that face there or the outside face, and it created a line. So if I say OK, I can, just like a construction plane, I can change the length of these just by clicking on the endpoints if I want to. So, drag that a little bit larger, whatever. Well, remember plane at an angle? It says creates a construction plane through an edge or an axis or a line. So now I can say plane at an angle, and I'm going to go ahead and click that line. And by default, it's at flat or -180 right there, and it's right through the middle of my cylinder, which is exactly what I want. I'll go ahead and shrink this down a little bit. I don't need it to be quite so big. Now I have a plane that I could offset. I want it to be 9 inches, so I'm going to type in 9IN. And so you can kind of see that jumps down 9 inches, or 228.6 millimeters. And I'll hit OK. Now I have a plane that I can sketch on, and we're going to grab some information to help us here. So I'm going to create a sketch on that bottom plane there. Let's just rotate it. I like to look at it kind of in this direction. I want to grab information from this cylinder. So P for project. And I know I've shown this multiple times, but the specified entities, if I were to project this cylinder, it will only project the edges. So let me turn off this, let me turn off the roller body. You'll see that it only projected the edges of the cylinder. That's because there isn't really an edge right there. So I'm going to undo. I'm going to do P for project again, but this time I'm going to change it to bodies. I'll click on that and say OK. And now you can see that it projected almost like a silhouette of that body. And so I did get those outside edges. So once again, in the project command, usually you're using specified entities. In this case, I said project bodies. Then I want to create a centered rectangle. Now, it looks like my origin is correct. I don't want to assume that. Let's pretend that that didn't happen. So how would I get a centered rectangle? Well, I'm just going to draw a line. I'm going to change my line type to construction. I'm just going to connect the dots. So I'm going to draw a line like so and a line like so. And notice the result. Notice where the center of the cylinder actually is. It is not right at that origin, even though it looked like it was. So definitely make sure you're doing things correctly. Don't assume that things are perfectly lined up or it's gonna catch to the corner even though I didn't project geometry, you know, that kind of stuff. So definitely check your work. And here's a prime example. Okay, so now I can do my rectangle. I don't want it to be a construction line. I want it to be centered. I'm going to grab that intersection right there, and you can see how it finds the midpoint. And I'm going to type in my 30 by 30. So I'm going to just do 30. I'll hit enter. Say I want that to be equal to that, and there we go. Hopefully that makes sense. So I can finish my sketch, and we can see that the sketch is down here. I want to extrude up and have it match that rectangle. So I'm going to turn off, I don't need the construction geometry, so I can turn off my little eyeball next to the construction. I do need my sketch, so I can't turn that off yet. I'm going to say extrude. I'm going to start to drag. Okay. Now, how far do I need to go? Well, instead of distance, I'm going to say to object. And I'll just click on this object, and you can see what it's doing. It's actually extruding from that profile plane up to this object, and it's even kind of wrapping around it to make that work. Okay, now I made a mistake. I didn't create a new component, so it's wanting to join. I'm going to say I don't want it to join. I want it to be a new component. So I could just do something like this and say OK, and you'll see that it created a new component that's separate from the roller. So you do have options. So let's go ahead and edit this, and I'm going to call it roller upright or something like that. Okay, and I'll activate that component. We'll fillet these edges. A lot of these, you know, have kind of rounded corners. So I grabbed all 4 corners. I'll say OK. I'll do my shell command. So I click on that face and do a shell. And let's do 1.5. I also want to shell this side, but you'll notice like this part's in the way. So once again, I'm just going to click and hold like so. The first face it hits is the cylinder. The next face it hits is the inside of the cylinder. And then the next face it hits is that curved surface. So I'm going to select that, and now you can see, sure enough, I was able to select that face, and it's hollow all the way through. So if I turn off that roller, we can see that's our shape. Okay. Now, if I try and move this guy, you'll see it moves together. I want to go ahead and position it where it needs to go, and I'm going to use that between 2 faces again. And I'm going to do it in this extension arm assembly. You'll notice it has its own joints folder, and since this joint is kind of related to the extension arm, that's where I'm going to do it. So I'm going to activate that guy, joint. Let's go ahead and specify that it's going to be a slider joint. I'm going to say between 2 faces. And here's a tip that I use. Which component, which one do I want to move? Well, I want to move this guy. And where do I want to move it to? I want to move it to this component over here. So that's kind of how I remember which faces do I click first. Well, this is the one I want to move. I'm doing between 2 faces, so I'll go ahead and select that. And again, just for fun, not having to rotate, I can probe through and grab that other face. Okay. Now, it doesn't look like I selected it correctly, so I didn't. So let me go ahead and click and hold. So that's the first face. That's the second inside face. There's the inside face, and then finally the outside face, which is what I want. So I was able to select both of those faces without rotating. I kind of get near the center. I'm going to kind of rotate isometrically so you can kind of see what's going on. I kind of get near the center, and you can see that point is in the middle between those two faces. So I'm just going to click right there, and that's where it grabbed it from. Where do I want to go? Between two faces. Same thing. I can do that guy there. Click and hold. That guy there. Never even had to rotate. Hover over this face. We can see that center mark. I'll go ahead and click. Now you can see it kind of did a quick little animation, but it's in the wrong location, and notice the curve. That's interesting. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, I don't want it to go in the Z-axis. I want it to go in the Y-axis, so that looks good. And in the position, I'm just going to hit this little flip icon, and you can see, sure enough, it flips the orientation. I'll say OK, and you'll notice that it did not move that component, which is unfortunate. Why did it not? Well, when I did the extrude, I just said extrude to that object. I did not do anything related to like a rigid joint or a rigid group or anything like that. Okay, so I'm going to step back like there. I'm going to keep that joint, that slider joint there. I don't want to have to undo all those clicks that I did. So I'm going to just step back, and right now I'm going to say rigid group, that guy and that guy, and say OK. And notice what it did. Here's my shell, then there's my rigid group. Now I'm going to step forward, and it moved. Okay, hopefully that made sense. There will be times where you make a mistake and you think, oh, the easiest thing to do is just undo and redo it. And that might be the fastest. But here I did lots of mouse clicks for the between two faces and all that kind of stuff. I didn't want to lose that. So I just went before that in time, said, let's group this together, and then moved back to the future, I guess, and let that joint type update. And because it knew the roller part had to be rigid, it moved with it. So kind of a cool little tip there. Hopefully you like that. Give a thumbs up if you did. So, okay. So I see a question that came through. Somebody said, do educators get Fusion 360? Is it free? So yes, if you go out to the Autodesk Fusion 360 webpage and kind of scroll down near the bottom, it'll show you the different types that we have, like the education version, etc. So I would recommend doing that, and that will walk you through. All you have to do is have a Autodesk ID, which is free. Okay, so I now have this guy, and you can see it slides up and down, and then the other extension slides in and out of the frame right here. So we're getting everything kind of working. So the last things I want to do here is kind of create those roller part here. So it is a plastic part that kind of slides into the side of this. So I'm going to create a new component under this workpiece assembly, because it's kind of part of this assembly. It's not part of this whole assembly. I mean, it is, but I kind of want to organize it underneath this guy. So I'm going to say new component. We'll call this guy roller cap. Okay. And then I'm going to create a sketch. So let's just click on this face, create a sketch. Now mine automatically projects the geometry. You can kind of see those black lines. So I don't even have to project. I'm going to just say finish, and you'll see that there is actually profiles that are already projected. And that is a preference I have turned on in my preferences. Some people like to have it automatically project, some people don't. So I think it is auto project geometry on active sketch plane under the general design. So by having that checked, you can see that it automatically projected the geometry, and now I can come in and actually select these two profiles and say extrude, and I didn't have to project them. So it saves me a step, basically. How far? Let's go ahead and do 7 millimeters out. Okay. Then I want to grab the profile that's in here, but if I click and hold, I don't see profile. And that is because by default, your sketches get turned off. Once you use a sketch, it assumes you're kind of done with it. And in fact, you can see the eyeball next to sketch 1 is turned off, so I'm going to turn that back on. Now if I click and hold, you can see it selects the faces, but I have an option in here for profile. So I'm going to click on profile, extrude. I'll start to drag so you can kind of visually see what we're doing here. We're basically creating a cap that's going to go inside this cylinder. And that's going to be, I think, minus 20. Let's just say, yep. And there we go. And I'm still just working on this roller cap. Everything else is kind of ghosted out. Let's fillet this edge. It's kind of a nice rounded edge, 4 millimeters. And you can kind of see, just really quickly, we've basically created this plastic cap. Now there's some really cool stuff going on with this cap in real life. I wish I could show it to you. I don't have it behind me in my camera anymore, so you'll have to just see what the final product looks like. So I need to add some geometry onto this cap here. So I'm going to create a sketch on that face. And I am going to project. I want to make sure that I'm grabbing some information here. So I am going to project that face because I want to get that center point right there. I'll create a circle, 20 millimeters in diameter. I'll create another circle, 16 millimeters in diameter. So I get something that looks like this. What we're going to do is we're basically going to create some notches that are kind of cut into this part. And there's 3 of them. So I'm going to just create a rectangle. So I could go to the menu, or I could hit R for rectangle. And I'm just going to draw a big rectangle, something like that. Okay. Then I want to make sure that the upper left corner, this corner here, always is touching this circle. So I'm going to say coincident, that corner and that circle, and you can see how it moved that point onto that circle. And then I'm going to say same thing with this lower right corner. I'm going to say that corner needs to touch this circle. And you can see my rectangle's kind of changed now. But as I change the size of this rectangle, you can see that sure enough it's keeping those points coincident to those circles. Now I'll go ahead and dimension this. I want it to be 3 millimeters. So I'll throw a dimension on there and say 3. And then I want it to be centered. Now I show this tip all the time where I draw a line, a construction line, and then I make it vertical. And every single time I do that, people are like, do you know about this other tip? And I always forget about this other tip. So now I'm going to remember it and show it to you. So I could, this is the old way, I could come in here and create a construction line, get near kind of the, let me zoom up here, get near the center of this rectangle, and you'll see that little triangle appear. Okay, and then I go to this point here. Then I say I want that line to be vertical, and watch what it does. Sure enough, that point has to stay centered or at the midpoint. Those have to stay coincident, so it gets fully constrained. But that was a lot of clicks and adding extra geometry. So check this out. Instead, I want the center of this line to be vertical with this point down here. So I'm going to say horizontal vertical. I'm going to click this point here, and then I'm going to zoom up so you can kind of see what's going on here. I'm going to hold down my shift key and hover over this line. Now you don't see anything happen until I get kind of near the middle, but it's snapping to the midpoint. So holding down the shift key, you'll notice I'm not holding it down, nothing happens. But if I hold down shift, it'll snap to the middle, and sure enough, it made the middle of that line vertical with the origin. So instead of having to draw that extra construction line and do a vertical constraint and a midpoint and all that kind of stuff, it kind of saves some time. But you have to remember to hold down the shift key to make that happen. But it's a cool tip. I really like that. I want 3 of these guys, so I'm going to do a rectangular pattern. So I'll come in here and say, I'm sorry, circular pattern. I'll draw a box around that. What's my center point? That's my center point. By default, it does 3, and we can kind of see the little preview of what that's going to look like. I'll say OK. And what that basically did is it created these 3 regions right here. That's what I'm aiming for. The next thing I want to do, since I'm in my sketch, I'm going to kind of prepare for we're going to have a whole bunch of like divots that go all the way around. So I'm going to create a line. And I want it to be a construction line, or even, yeah, I'll do a construction line. I want it to be 14 millimeters vertical from the center. So I'm going to start to draw, and then you can see I can rotate slightly, and it's going to snap vertically, and then I could type in a distance of 14, and that's going to create a construction line that's vertical. And I can use that to draw a circle at the endpoint right there. Now, I'll foreshadow, this is going to come back to bite me a little bit, and you'll see how we're going to resolve that. But I'm going to go ahead and draw a 6 millimeter diameter circle, like so, and I'll finish my sketch. So I kind of used that time to get this stuff going on here, and then also this location for these divots, which you'll see here in just a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and select these profiles, extrude. How far? I like to start to drag to kind of show the direction, and then I can type in my distance. Let's just say -3. Okay, so we kind of made those little indentations. I also want to have a hole that goes through here. So I'll use the hole command, click on the face just kind of randomly, and then watch what happens when I move this around. You see that white dot? That's the center of that face. So all I have to do is kind of drag that blue dot, and it's going to snap right to that white dot, and I know it's perfectly centered. It remembered my last size. Let's just pretend it said 15. Okay. I want it to be 12, so I'm going to say 12. And I want it to go all the way through the cap. So I'm just going to say all. And it's going to figure out what it needs to do to go all the way through the cap. And that's all I need. I'll say OK. And we can see, sure enough, it went all the way through the cap. Okay. Now I want to create these indentations. So let me turn this back on, this sketch. And I basically want to revolve and cut that away. So I'm going to say revolve, and it says, what's your profile? That's my profile. And then what's the axis? Well, I'm going to say revolve around this axis right here, but you'll notice I get an error message, and it basically says the profile crosses the revolve axis. And it does. If you look at this, it's this whole circle it's kind of revolving on itself. What I really want is half of a circle to revolve. But you'll notice I, dimensioned this center line here, or this construction line. So I don't have a great way to get half of this. Well, I could draw an extra line. Let's just do an extra center line from here up to the top. Okay. Now I have a point there and a point down here that I can use to break. And this is actually a pretty cool command. Watch what happens when I hover over this arc right here, or this circle. You see those two little X's appear. It's going to break this line segment wherever the other line segments cross over it or touch it. So I'm going to click there, and you'll notice that this is broken in half. Okay, let's finish the sketch. Notice it's still all one profile. So what do I need to do? Well, I can come in here and change these line types to not be solid or construction, and now you can see I have half of a circle. So I didn't have to redraw. I mean, I could have drawn a solid line from there to there. I could have, but it wasn't necessary. Okay, so now I'm going to come into Revolve. What's my profile? Now I have half of a profile. What's my axis? I can click on that edge there, and sure enough, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's taking that profile, and because it's intersecting, it's doing a cut. If I said join, it would create a sphere like so, but we want to do a cut, and I'll say okay. Let me turn off the sketches, and so you can kind of see what it did. It took that half moon, revolved it around, and it scooped that out. We'll come in here and do a circular pattern. By default, it's usually set to faces. Could I just select this face? Yes, I could. But honestly, I always try and do features. And I can say this revolve feature. That way, if I came back and changed that revolve feature by adding, extra faces or whatever, I don't have to go back and select those extra faces. It's going to grab anything that has to do with that revolve feature. So I'm going to say features. What's my axis? I'll just do this guy here. It remembered my last number. Usually it's 3. I can drag this little arrow here. You can see in the plus direction, I can do that, or the minus direction. Or I can come in and type. And I'll just say okay. And now we have those little indentations in there. Okay. Almost done here. So I'm going to turn off this roller body and create a sketch on this back face. We're going to create some indentations that allow it to slide into the roller much easier. So again, I'm going to project some geometry here. Draw a rectangle. And I'm just going to kind of draw it out here in space. And I want it to be 1 millimeter tall, 6 millimeters wide. And I want it to be vertically constrained. And I think I should have done a centered rectangle. I apologize. Let me do that again. Rectangle, centered rectangle. In fact, I'll go ahead and just click on this edge here. We'll do the 1 by 6 again. And then I want it to be vertically constrained. So I'm going to do that point here and that shift to get that point there. And sure enough, it's now fully constrained. Okay. Finish my sketch. Now, my sketch went away, and that's because I had turned off my sketches. So I'll turn those guys off. I don't need them, but I want sketch 3 to be visible. Now, I also want to make this easy to insert into the roller, so I'm going to chamfer this edge. Now, if I click on this edge and right mouse click, I don't see the chamfer command. And that's because my sketch is turned on and it found that projected edge. So how would I select the edge to chamfer it? Well, just click and hold, and you can see the first thing it found was the sketch arc. The next thing it finds is the edge. So I'm going to say edge, and now I see my edge commands instead of my sketch commands. So I'm going to say chamfer. I like to start to give it a slight dimension there by dragging the arrow. Well, I want this to be sloped differently, so instead of equal distance, I'm going to say to distance. And now you see I get these two arrows. I'm going to start to drag, and you can see how we can add quite a bit of slope here. Well, I don't want it to be too much, so I'm going to say let's go down 1 millimeter, and let's go over 4 millimeters or something like that. Okay. And so now we've kind of tapered that. My sketch is still there. I'll go ahead and select those profiles, say extrude, start to drag, and we can kind of visually see what that's going to do. And you can kind of see how it's slicing into my chamfer, which is really cool. And I want it to go to this face right here. So I'm going to say to object. Click on that face. Apologize. Click on that face and you'll see that it snaps right to that face. Obviously we want it to cut. I'll say OK. And we got an interesting shape just by using a rectangle, right? Now I could have created a plane tangent to this and drawn a rectangle from the top and extruded down a certain distance. That would totally work. But since I had a flat face here, that's kind of why I drew my rectangle on that flat face and extruded back to this wall. And just like we did with the spheres, I'm going to come in here and do a circular pattern. Again, I love to use features because I can just click on this extrude feature. It's going to select all of the faces that have to do with that extrude feature. I didn't have to manually come in and zoom up and select that face and this face over here. What's my axis? I'll just click on that cylinder. It remembered 12 from the last time. I'll say OK. And we now have a cap that looks like this. Let's go ahead and add a black plastic material to it. And that's what it looks like in real life. I wish I could show it to you. And because we kind of built it in place, if I turn this roller back on, you can see it's exactly where it needs to be. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and put it on the other side. So I'm going to activate this workpiece assembly. And I'm going to rigid group that guy and that guy together. I want them to stay together. So if I were to move one of them, you can kind of see that guy moves with it. But I also want to have this on the other side. So I'm going to basically be at this level here, right click on roller cap, and I'm going to say move copy. And the first thing I want to do is say create a copy. Then I'm just going to drag this to the left. I'll rotate that around 180 degrees. And I have a couple options here. I could basically position it in here, which is what I'm going to do, or I could say OK and create a joint. Well, I'm just going to say go from point to point, and check this out. I'm going to say go from basically this edge, and you can kind of see the little plus. I'm going to hover. It's going to be down in this area right here. When I hover over that edge, you see that little plus. I'm going to say go from the that point there, and then to this point here, and it puts the cap in place. Okay? And if I wanted to, I could say rigid group. I probably should have done the rigid group after I had done that. Doesn't really matter. I'll say that guy and that guy. In fact, maybe I'll just do all three of them, say OK, and now they all move together. I could have created a joint and positioned it in place, made it a rigid joint. That would totally work. But you can also see you can just use the move command, and since I know these are going to be rigid with each other, I just positioned them and then made them a rigid group. Okay, so hopefully you learned something new, some new tips and tricks. I kind of went through some challenges, for example, using the thin wall extrude versus using a primitive with shell. What are the pros and cons? Hopefully you learned some stuff there. Kind of the reorganizing of assemblies where you kind of just start to build things and then reorganize them. I love the fact that you can do that. Stay tuned next week for another Fusion 360 live stream. We'll have a cam live stream for you. And then I think we're only going to have maybe 1 or 2 more sessions of this. I want to do an exploded assembly drawing with the bills of materials and the balloons and everything, but that's kind of where we'll end this whole series. So if you have any other ideas on what you'd like to see in a future series, not only on what I'm doing, but also what Angelo's doing for cam, definitely throw them in the chat or throw them in the comments. We do read those, and we appreciate all of you that attend these live streams. And have a wonderful rest of your day and have fun fusioning. Thank you.